The motion was subtle at first, a faint drift measured across successive frames, each captured hours apart and aligned with care. Against a dense background of distant stars, 3i Atlas did not change suddenly. It shifted just enough for the measurements to hesitate, as if the object were gently resisting the simplest predictions placed upon it. These differences were small, fractions of arcseconds, the kind that mean nothing on their own. But they repeated. Night after night, the object arrived slightly offset from where basic models suggested it should be. Not far enough to be wrong, close enough to demand attention. What made this observation matter was not the size of the deviation, but its consistency. Random variation scatters in all directions. This did not. The residuals leaned the same way, quietly but persistently. In astronomy, that is often the moment when routine tracking becomes careful watching. Brightness measurements followed a similar pattern. As 3i Atlas continued along its path, its reflected light showed gentle variation. Nothing abrupt. Nothing that violated physical expectations. Yet the changes did not scale cleanly with distance alone. They suggested mild activity, constrained, ordinary, but real, rather than a perfectly inert object passing through unchanged. At this stage, no explanations were offered. There was no announcement, no shift in public language, but internally the tone became more deliberate. Notes began to emphasize continued monitoring. Error margins were revisited. Models were adjusted, not because they had failed, but because they were no longer sufficient on their own. If you prefer to follow observations like this as they develop slowly, the subscribe button simply keeps this thread of careful watching within reach, without requiring anything more than quiet attention. The object itself remained indifferent to interpretation. What changed was the discipline around it. Observation intervals tightened. Independent data sets were compared side by side. The goal was not to explain, but to ensure that repetition would either confirm or gently correct what was being seen. When an object stops behaving randomly, the first response is restraint. Scientists resist the urge to label. They focus instead on consistency, on whether the pattern holds under different conditions, different instruments, different assumptions. With 3i Atlas, repetition continued to do the work. Each new measurement landed close to where refined models suggested it would, reinforcing the sense that the motion was constrained by something more than chance. Still, nothing pointed to a single cause. Activity can arise from many ordinary processes, especially when an object encounters a new environment. What mattered was that randomness was no longer the most useful frame. The object had become more legible, even as its nature remained unresolved. And in that narrowing space between unpredictability and understanding, observation begins to carry a different weight. The data continued to arrive, quietly reducing the range of what could reasonably be said, without yet telling us what must be true. As the observations accumulated, attention shifted away from individual measurements and toward relationships between them. Position, brightness, and timing were no longer treated as separate streams of information. They began to be examined together, looking for coherence rather than coincidence. The trajectory of 3i Atlas, once described adequately by broad assumptions, now required tighter constraints. Small non-gravitational influences were considered, not as conclusions, but as possibilities to be tested against the data. These influences are common in small bodies, especially when surface material responds unevenly to heating. What mattered was not whether such processes were present, but whether they could account for what was being measured without introducing new inconsistencies. Brightness variations were revisited with this in mind. When plotted across time, They suggested a pattern that was stable enough to be modeled, but not simple enough to be reduced to a single parameter. Rotation, surface irregularities, and modest activity all remained on the table. None dominated. Each explained part of the behavior, but not all of it. This is often the most delicate phase of analysis. The data are good enough to rule things out, but not yet good enough to settle on what remains. Confidence grows in what the object is not, while what it is stays just out of reach. Scientists tend to become more cautious here, not less. If you choose to stay with this process as it unfolds, even when progress feels incremental, remaining connected allows the details to build naturally over time. Comparisons with other interstellar objects offered limited guidance. Each such visitor arrives with its own history, shaped long before entering our observational range. Similarities can be suggestive, but they rarely transfer cleanly. For 3i Atlas, analogies helped frame questions, not answers. Models were refined again, parameters narrowed, uncertainties shrank, though they did not disappear. Importantly, no single data set stood alone. Independent observations began to agree within tighter margins, reinforcing the sense that the behavior being tracked was real, not an artifact of measurement or method. Still, restraint remained central. Activity does not imply anything unusual by itself. Many small bodies respond predictably to changing environments. The significance lay not in the presence of activity, but in how consistently it shaped the object's motion and light. At this point, language became more careful rather than more confident. Phrases like appears consistent with and remains under evaluation carried weight. They signaled that understanding was improving, even as conclusions were deliberately withheld. What emerged was not an answer, but a clearer boundary around uncertainty. The range of plausible explanations narrowed. The space of randomness continued to shrink. And yet, the object itself offered no final clarity, only behavior that could be tracked, tested, and slowly understood. The work continued in that narrow corridor between what could be excluded and what could not yet be affirmed, where patience matters as much as precision. By the time the later observations were folded in, the picture had become quieter, but also firmer, not clearer in the sense of resolution, but steadier in its outlines. The behavior of the 3i Atlas no longer fluctuated between interpretations. It remained within a narrowing corridor of possibility, shaped by constraints rather than speculation. What could be said with confidence was limited, and that limitation itself carried meaning. The motion could be modeled without invoking extremes. The brightness variation stayed modest. Any activity inferred from the data appeared restrained, consistent with ordinary physical processes, acting under unfamiliar conditions. Nothing demanded urgency. Nothing invited dismissal. This is often how understanding advances in astronomy, not through revelation, but through endurance. The object continues to move. The instruments continue to measure. And slowly, the questions change shape. Instead of asking what something might be, scientists ask how precisely it behaves, and under what conditions those behaviors shift. For 3i Atlas, that shift was subtle but important. It was no longer approached as a statistical outlier to be averaged away. It was treated as a system worth characterizing on its own terms. That change does not resolve uncertainty. It makes uncertainty more useful. Limits became clearer. Certain explanations grew less likely. Others remained plausible but constrained. Importantly, nothing about the object required assumptions beyond known physics. The challenge was not a lack of theory, but the patience required to let observation lead rather than follow expectation. As the object continued on its path, it gradually left the most favorable range for detailed measurement. This too is common. Many questions in astronomy are shaped as much by timing as by curiosity. What remains is the record, carefully gathered, cautiously interpreted, and open to re-examination as methods improve. If this way of following space, through careful watching rather than conclusions, feels worth returning to, the subscribe button remains a simple way to keep that continuity, allowing future observations to find you without urgency or interruption. In the end, 3-hour Atlas did not offer a single answer. It offered something quieter, a reminder that randomness is often a placeholder, and that with enough attention, patterns begin to emerge, not fully explained but responsibly understood. The object moves on, unchanged by scrutiny. What stays behind is a clearer sense of how much can be learned by watching closely, and how much remains open when conclusions are allowed to wait.